Well, let's get a gauge on the big stories of the day. Luke Gittos is with us. He's a lawyer, a writer, and an all-round good bloke. How are you, Luke?
Yeah, very well.
Nice to have you with us. We are 2 weeks away today. In fact, in 2 weeks' time, we won't be allowed to talk about this stuff, of course, because of the laws of the land precludes us from even mentioning that there's an election on that day, other than during the news. But of course, this story, this top story to look at, the misery that is deepening after this crock of polls, a trio of mega polls found the Tories on track for their worst ever result. Even Rishi Sunak, Luke, could lose his seat. Let's have a look then at the two main players in action.
Whatever you might think of it, it is an idea that's transformational for our society.
Well, the Army don't like it.
But Keir Starmer, all he can do is sneer at it. Sneer at it because you don't have any ideas for the future. You don't have anything that's bold, that's going to transform our country for the better. And in fact, everywhere I've been, since I've made the announcement, I've had people talking to me about how they think it will be wonderful for their children, how they think it will change our country for the better, and it's an example of the bold action that I'm prepared to take to do things differently to deliver a more secure future. You don't have big ideas like that.
They've been in power for 14 years. And after 14 years, with a few weeks to go before the election, they come out with this desperate idea. If it's such a brilliant idea, why for 14 years has your government not lifted a finger to do it?
Well, it's either going to be him or him, but it's looking increasingly, Luke, like it's only going to be him, if you take the point. Good afternoon, Luke.
Yeah, good afternoon. I mean, your phone in this afternoon should be absolutely fascinating, because I'm not yet convinced that the coalition that came together in 2019 around Boris Johnson's Conservative Party has gone anywhere. I'm not convinced that suddenly this the majority voters, the voters that gave Boris Johnson his majority, have changed their minds to Labour. It's worth remembering a couple of points about these polls. The first is that Labour could secure these kinds of results by persuading a relatively small proportion of the overall population. It's not as though they have to, that this reflects the fact that they have changed the minds of voters across the board. In fact, one thing that is, I would predict, and obviously wary of predictions at this stage, but it looks as though turnout is going to be a real issue at this election, or could be. And these polls do reflect the kind of results that can arise even with a kind of 30 to 50% voter turnout. So it's worth bearing that in mind. And just compare this to 97, as you did in your opening remarks. I mean, Tony Blair had a very clear policy break with old Labour. He was running on the basis of taking voters back from the Tory party on issues such as law and order. He was the person, whilst Home Secretary, who coined the phrase tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. And this was seen as a major inroad into a traditional Tory issue. Here, what we have is Starmer on policy, on ideas. There just isn't that much difference between him and the Tory party, him and Sunak. The voters in 2019, voters who care about immigration, who broadly backed Brexit, who were broadly in their outlook socially conservative, I'm not convinced they've gone anywhere. Yeah. I do think that this polling reflects inevitable distrust and dissatisfaction with the Tories, which the Labour Party are currently seen as the only possible beneficiaries of. I do think, though, that there is a sort of radical undercurrent to this election. If the Tories do face a kind of extinction level event, which is very, very possible, then you do have parties like Reform making the kind of arguments that the major parties just aren't willing to talk about. So, for example, there's been a lot of back and forth between Sunak and Starmer about our membership of the European Court of Human Rights. Nigel Farage has the room to simply say, look, I would leave that court. And I would use leaving that court as a way of retaining and regaining control over our borders. And he is, even though these polls do not reflect a significant electoral impact, I think he is shaping the debate. And I think that's also true of the other smaller parties as well. I think the Lib Dem putting, for example, care on the agenda, social care, one of the big issues that neither of the two main parties want to talk about. It's the Lib Dems that are talking about that in their manifesto. And both senior figures in both parties have been taken to task on their lack of any plan around social care, and none of them have any answer. So I do think there is this, undercurrent of ideas at this election, which hopefully if the Tories do face a kind of extinction level event, there will be a gap on the right of the country. And I think Labour will inevitably fall into difficulties, even when they have a very, very large majority, because I just don't believe that Starmerism has won over the British population. I think you're going to see a lot of very, very dissatisfied voters who then in the next 4 years after the election will be there for the taking. And that's potentially quite exciting for the emergence of new movements.
We're going to watch with interest on this one. And many people are saying, many Reform voters are just looking and, sensing they're reading the room and thinking, hang on, is it? So everything that we're hearing about the increase in Reform success, that's all nonsense. None of that is true. I mean, they are up on the polls from where they were. In some polls, they overtake the Conservatives. And yet when it comes to sort of this trio of huge polls, they're nowhere to be seen, Luke.
Well, I don't think they necessarily need to show up on the polls in order to be having success. They have shaped the debate and they have shaped events in this election in ways that aren't necessarily playing out in the polls. As I say, Nigel Farage is a presence in this election in a way which he has tried to be in the past and failed. So I do think they are achieving some success. And I do think, as I say, one of the discussions that's bubbling away under the surface is whether there will be some form of merger between Reform and the Conservatives if they do suffer a very significant defeat, or even in the lead up to the election. All bets, who knows what will happen. But I do think that in the event of the kind of enormous Labour majority that you're seeing, there will have to be a realignment on the right of British politics. There will have to be some new force to step in and speak for the people that will inevitably left feeling unrepresented by a massive Labour majority. This is not a party that has come up with a set of ideas that are suddenly completely dominant in public life. I mean, I think if you spoke to most of the people responding to this poll, they would not be able to tell you a clear policy difference between Starmer and Sunak.
Correct.
I don't think policy difference is what is making the difference in these polls. I think it's exhaustion, it's desperation, and Labour at the moment are the only recipients of that disillusionment. But that could change. If there are changes on the right of British politics, then everything could be thrown up in the air. And that's why I don't think, even if we do end up with a very significant Labour majority, I think, oddly, it could be a very unstable one, because the forces that propelled Boris Johnson to government in 2019, I don't think have gone anywhere.
Let's move to another story here. Working from home. I mean, that's always a bit of a hot one that hits the news agenda from time to time. A new survey, a 2-year, 1,600 person controlled study has found, you might be happier, maybe less efficient. It's found that hybrid working makes staff smile a little bit more, but does not hold back promotions and reduce resignations. But this guy, have a listen to this man, he doesn't think so.
Despite being digital natives, fully 95% of Generation Z and 93% of millennials are having a tough time making the transition to the virtual work environment. I mean, let's face it, working from home is hard.
Is it? But really? Is it hard, Luke? You must be a little bit from home. You're a busy dad as well as a lawyer. I mean, how tough is it having to sit there on the sofa, having a sandwich when you fancy, a latte in one hand, bit of toast between your toes? What sort of day is that?
I'm not eating toast with my toes, but listen, I can't stand working from home. I think it's catastrophic for mental health because it completely elides the home space with your workspace. And for me, I relish that chance to have that space between leaving my private abode and going into the workplace and entering the public. I do think that over long periods, this is unsustainable, the idea of working from home consistently, especially when you look at the professions. Yeah. I mean, we are in the legal profession, we are more than a box on a Zoom call. We're more than someone answering emails. We're a human being in person who have to interact with clients, and we have to interact with one another. And I think that's probably true of all the big professions. I don't think long-term accountants, lawyers, doctors, it's not a sustainable model if you're looking at the big professions. I do think it reflects something about the changing nature of work. I think there probably are more and more jobs nowadays which are capable of being done remotely. But I do think people will come to realize that when you work for someone, your presence, your human presence in a room is your best advert. It's the best advert for you as an employee.
Totally.
just won't be able to communicate that over a Zoom call or over an email. And the reality is, I do think it will hold back social mobility, because quite often, when someone is perhaps limited in their abilities in, for example, emailing, writing, they may have difficulties with their written English, etc. You can often accommodate that or work around it if they are competent in person, if they have good personal skills, if they're a personable individual to be around. You can sort of make allowances for that. Whereas if you are just answering emails and appearing on Zoom calls, you lose out on that accommodation. You are reduced to your ability to answer emails or appear on a Zoom call.
Absolutely.
So I think that will play out in
and also not meet. I mean, they're saying that, you know, give it a couple of years and there'd be no difference in the people getting promotions between the group that go to work, the people that don't go into work, etc. But I mean, you'll be in a curious place where you may never meet your boss, and, you know, very briefly, and once in a while you're going to the workplace. Oh, yeah, you're Jemima. All right, we've been talking for 2.5 years. We've never met. I mean, I just think, as you rightly allude to there, Luke, that the kind of social factor of, I can't imagine not coming into work. I mean, despite the fact, you know, I look around me, I look at the room in front of me, all the guys that I'm working with today. I mean, it is like the Addams family. It's very dysfunctional. It's a very, very odd thing to, you know, what I can see right now, Luke, is not pretty. However, I think they might fire the same thing back at me. And of course, to not be in that place where you have a chat and a giggle and a, you know, a laugh, and that's so crucial to existence, I would have thought. But listen, we will leave that thought there.